So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here with us, and thanks, Julie, for the opportunity too. I appreciate it. The title of this session is Implementing Routines for Children with Visual and Multiple Impairments, including Deaf Blindness. Our session objectives today are to build some knowledge and support implementation of routines with visual impairments and additional disabilities, including deaf blindness. So topics that we're going to cover are: what are routines, why are routines important for our children, and frankly for all children and all people, initial steps for implementation, and then we're going to move through a couple of sample routines and where to go for more information. I've been wanting to throw the new information from Iowa's alternate assessment as the content relates today to DLM's expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes. I'm primarily going to be talking about these three populations of children in the pre-intentional, attend, and respond category. So those very earliest stages of communication and cognition. And that pre-intentional category, or in that category, behavior reflects a general state, but does not reflect intentional behavior. In attending, they're orienting to objects, people, or the activity. It indicates some selective attention to stimuli in the learning environment. And in the respond category, students are having that intentional response using any mode of expression. It indicates joint attention to materials and activities in the learning environment. And just as a reminder of where these kids are at, again, in the foundational node example, pre-intentionally expressing discomfort, and then pre-intentionally expressing comfort, expressing interest in others, and responding to stimuli. We're going to talk about that category of kids and how we're moving those children up that continuum through the use of routines. Currently, some of the educational pitfalls that specifically this population of children suffers from is that teaching these children is outside agencies rather than topics that the child is interested in discussing and exploring. And we're going to talk about that at length when we start to develop routines. We've got to figure out what these kids like so that we can motivate them to communicate and to engage with us and learn from us. Children are expected to engage in topics they have no interest, understanding, or connection to. They have to have a connection or some kind of interest to the content, the platform, the things that we're teaching about. Teaching is typically done from a distance for a lot of our kids, especially for our kids with visual impairments and or hearing impairments or some kind of auditory processing issue. Teaching from a distance challenges their ability to bring that information and learn from that content that they need. Hope that kind of makes sense. It'll make sense subsequent to this. Learning isn't fun. Learning has to be fun for our kids. We have to engage them outside of their body. In that last presentation that we talked about relationships and bringing our children beyond their body, bringing them outside of their bodies and into the world out beyond their body. And in order to do that, we got to make learning fun for them. Also, there's frequently a lot of distractions. Distractions for us as teachers because we have a lot of people coming and going in our classroom, and sometimes distractions for our kids. And the reason why distractions for our kids happen very frequently is sometimes they have so much information coming in that they can't effectively filter some of that information, and we got to be mindful of that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further in the presentation. And also, education is often hurried, so the value of waiting quietly and watching is often lost. Our kids, we talked about this in our last session on tactile strategies, our kids are moved too quickly. We need to slow down, slow everything down, and watch them. And learn from them what they need. Okay, so what can we do? We can do routines. Every teacher, every parent, every person uses some system of routines or procedures to support learning and everyday functioning. Everybody's routines have been thrown off probably the first 3 days of this week because of snow. Those are the routines that we use in order to function and in order to learn and support learning. Many gen ed teachers use the first two to 3 weeks of school to teach students in the classroom rules and procedures to support learning. These are essentially routines. So for instance, when I was a preschool teacher, the things that I used to teach my kids were, how do you go to the bathroom? How do you sit and listen at circle time? How do you go to, how does lunchtime work? How does that procedure work? All of those things we teach during the first 2 weeks of schools, so it frees up some of that, what I'll call cognitive RAM for our kids, so that they're more ready to learn and they know when learning is going to occur. Also for parents, they have a morning and or a bedtime routine. All of us do. What are routines? They are an instructional strategy developed to increase consistency and repetition in order to learn. Any activity can be designed to be a routine, and in fact, most are. What happens for our kids is some of that content that's within a routine may not be accessible, and they may not be clear on what they're supposed to do within that routine. The power of a routine for children with multiple disabilities is the precise planning of what the student will do and how he will do it on each step of the routine. Many students are able to participate at a higher level when this instructional strategy is used because they need the following things that routines provide. Consistent expectations. The access to information. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about vision and hearing. They've got to have access to information, either visual, auditory, or tactile information in order to learn. Everything we learn comes in through one sense. Predictability of what is going to be, of what help is going to be given. When they're going to be prompted and when they're not going to be prompted. Anticipation of what's going to happen next. And practice of new skills in natural, functional contexts. Routines provide an opportunity to communicate around a familiar topic. Something that's familiar to the student, not necessarily from our perspective, but from their perspective. They help the child feel comfortable so he or she can use his energy and attention more efficiently. Routines reduce stress. Okay, so they feel comfortable within that routine. They know the sequence of steps, so they can feel comfortable within that routine. They develop a sense of beginning, middle, and end to an activity. That's really important for our kids. Sometimes they don't know when things are beginning and when things are going to end. Sometimes things go on and on and on. And sometimes non-preferred things go on and on. They have to know when it's going to end. And that's also starts our concepts of time. That also begins teaching these kids about concepts of time. They help weave a cluster of people, actions, objects, and locations into a meaningful whole. Sometimes we think our kids have access to the same information that we do in terms of the room, what's around us, and that gives us all kinds of incidental clues to what's going to happen. Our kids don't always have that. So it helps weave this cluster, all those clusters of information together into a meaningful whole. Makes use of natural cues. One step leads to the next step, and that leads to the next step. It can help a child anticipate an end to an undesired activity or recognize the beginning of a desired activity. That's that piece of behavior regulation right there too. They know this is, if they don't enjoy this, it's going to end, and they know that something is going to happen next. It builds a memory foundation for procedural learning. So when you're within the context of a routine, if you're teaching something new, if you're using that same framework that we always use, when you teach something new, it's highlighted. It's highlighted for them, and it's clear for them. It provides an internal picture of an activity so the child can recognize when something changes, which is kind of what I just said. The goal of routines is to provide social experiences that facilitate acts, that stimulate curiosity. Curiosity is how our kids learn, that motivate interactions, and that develop skills. Routines use the right media, the right thing that stimulates their curiosity to get them to learn. And I think it's the slide after this, we're going to talk about the learning media hierarchy for our kids. The learning media hierarchy for our kids. Remember how we talked about, well, and we'll talk about this a little bit more during active learning session. Our kids learn from here out, from in out. So they first start to learn about their own body, then they learn about another body, then an object touching the body, and an object beyond the body. That's the learning media hierarchy for our kids. Sometimes we move too quickly up that hierarchy for our children, and then we wonder why they're not getting it. In terms of the right media, then also that limbic sorting system, that part of their brain that says, I like this and I don't like this. When I like something, then I'm motivated to attend to it. So we're going to use that I like it pile in order for them to attend to what we're teaching. And then the curiosity window, which helps our kids avoid extended states. Extended states are either our child is sleeping or our child is fussy and agitated. We want to keep them right in the middle of those two states, which is what we will call, and you'll see this in subsequent slides, quiet alert or active alert. If our kids are either sleeping or agitated, they're not learning, and that's what we would call extended states. So here's that pyramid I just referred to, the developmental levels. Millie Smith published this in her SAM guidebook. And I think it's really important for us to remember for our kids that first they start learning about their own body, and then they learn about people, objects, and actions touching the body, then beyond the body, and then events and relationships in events beyond the body. And if you look back to that DLM's expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes, I think it aligns real well with Millie's inverted pyramid. Okay, so routines have to meet criteria. The first one is that there's a clear signal to the student the activity is starting. Sometimes our kids don't know an activity is starting, so then they're not sure how much they need to attend. So there has to be a clear activity to the student that the activity is starting. Might be clear to me, might be clear to the parent, but it's got to be clear to the student. The steps of the activity have to occur in the same sequence every time. Each step is done in the same way each time. And initially, especially for our kids that are at those very earliest stages, that pre-attentional and attending stage, it's got to be the same material, same person, same place, because those are all things that give our kids cues about what's happening here and what they're going to be expected to do. Assistance has to be given in the same way each time until the student is ready for less support. And that's not just something we randomly decide. We discuss that as a team, and we consider that support and weaning that support off, or that assistance. Pacing of instruction is precisely maintained until the activity is finished. And this is a big important one, and this is one that I get feedback from a lot of teachers about. It's hard, it's very hard, especially in your level 3 classrooms. It can be real hard not to have side conversations when you're doing these routines with our kids, but it's real important. So no side conversations, no going off to get something you forgot in the middle of this, or spontaneously adding new or different steps that don't happen the next time the activity is done. And then there has to be a clear signal to the student that the activity is finished. Sounds easy, but sometimes it can be a real challenge. And in terms of communication for our kids, a lack of complete information leads to limited opportunities to observe and participate. They may be unaware communication exists or the power of communication, and they may be unaware that their behavior is communicating. They may also try to express their needs in ways that seem very inappropriate to others. I think that slide's a little misplaced. It seems out of context there. But anyway. Okay, so now we're going to move into that piece of how to develop routines for our kids. And the very first thing that I feel is critically important for kids, especially whenever you get a new student, is we got to do a file or a record review, and especially because these kids have very complicated etiologies and medical histories, and often they're on a lot of different medications. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at their etiology. What's the cause of their disability? Was it meningitis? Do they have cerebral palsy? Is it a traumatic brain injury? All those things are important because then we get some clues or some insight into their abilities about how to gather information, into their ability for learning, and also in terms of it might be an explanation for some of their behaviors. So I'm going to give you an example. We had a young man who had the etiology of meningitis. He had cortical visual impairment as well. Meningitis is one of the leading causes of hearing impairment. So we weren't sure then, because of that etiology, if he was having a hard time hearing. This was a young preschool-aged little boy. And so what we recommended is further testing and or observation as it related to his ability to access information auditorily. The other thing that sometimes kids with meningitis do is sometimes they might have pretty major mood swings and have behavior problems. And this was another thing the team was struggling with. And to some degree, when you understand the etiology, that helps you know, okay, this is just part of perhaps who that child is. Not to say that we can't put some interventions in place to help support some of that, but it just helps us understand that child more. Health history in terms of medications and hospitalizations. Medications are always important, and that's for me for two big reasons. Because medication affects our availability to learn. You guys know if you take medication, how that can affect you at different times. Might make you more tired, might make you more alert or aroused, all kinds of things that it might do to you. And the other piece for our kids that are multiply impaired is I've had some instances, one instance in particular, where I had a student who needed emergency services, and the first thing they asked me was, give me a list of medications for this child. So I think it's important in terms of safety issues for our kids, and it's important also in terms of our understanding of how it affects that child's ability to learn. Hospitalizations too. Our kids have had a lot of hospitalizations. And for some of our kids, those can be very traumatic experiences for our kids, and it helps to explain a little, potentially, about how they react in certain situations. Assessment information, historical assessment information, and we're going to go through a little bit of that on the next slide, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Educational history, where have they been? How long have they been there? In what environments have they been? I also like to look over the IEP history, just to see what goals and services they've had in the past and any other relevant IEP information. Because sometimes things, and you guys know this if you've been doing this for a while, sometimes things slip in and slip out of our kids' IEP histories. So I think it's a good idea to review those things. So in terms of educational assessments, what we're looking for specifically is the vision assessment, particularly the functional vision assessment. That's in the next slide here too, and so I'll cover that a little bit more. And the learning media assessment, hearing assessments. Again, we've got to know how these kids are accessing information. If we don't know how information is coming in through their sensory system, then we can't have a clear understanding of what their needs are, what their adaptations and accommodations are as it relates to their access to information. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I hope somebody asks a question. Speech, we want to know in terms of communication what they've tried in the past, what things have worked, what things haven't. Sometimes we have kids that will have a list of words that they've had in the past. We want to know what those words, what those symbols, what those signs are. so that we can help to support that. And then PT reports, potentially seating and positioning. Everything you do, everything we do starts with our body being in a ready position. And so we want to know what things PT has or has not recommended in the past in terms of this child's positioning and seating. OT, occupational therapy, you know, touch, fine motor, how are they using their hands? How are they using their hands to access information? And then finally, when you consider your students, when you're looking through all those educational assessments and all that history, do the pieces fit and do those results make sense? If they don't, then you might need to ask some questions. I want to cover this because I think it's real important, and then just because of the, you know, the field that I'm in, one of the required assessments is the functional vision assessment. And it includes information for our kids on visual reflexes, appearance of the eyes, corrective lenses, reception and perception of visual stimuli, so light, how much light are they getting, light perception, muscle balance, eye preference and behavior. That's important because if you're presenting something visually to a child, you want to know if there's an eye preference or a field of vision, or if there's some field of vision that's missing. So we have kids with colobomas that can potentially be missing that lower half of their visual field. And if you're presenting a picture communication system in a lower field of vision, our kids don't have access. Your student don't have access. And then sometimes you wonder, why are they not making progress on this? And sometimes it's because they don't have access. Depth perception, that can affect movement, like if they're moving in a stander or a walker, they can be scared because they don't have depth perception. Figure ground perception, light sensitivity, that's real important for our kids that are going for a number of reasons, but I've seen it happen with kids. They'll have behavior problems sometimes because of light sensitivity, because they go outside or they come in very well lit rooms and they're very sensitive, and so then they might need some kind of glasses or a hat. Contrast sensitivity and acuity, that's important when you're designing things like picture communication systems, or when you're asking them to access visual information on a computer. Visual motor coordination, glare, that's important for things that are laminated. Lighting, color and contrast, visual clutter. We've seen kids where if I presented a teeny tiny little object to them on a black surface or a dark surface, they could see it, but if you present it, that's another object to them on one of those, let's say those preschool carpets that have all the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s on it, they can't even seem to walk across that because there's so much visual information there that it hinders their ability to access information, and then they don't want to walk across that surface. And then information on any of the visual diagnosis that they have too, because that can be real critical. Our top three visual diagnoses are cortical visual impairment, optic nerve hypoplasia, and retinopathy prematurity. Retinopathy prematurity is a result of a child being born premature. Optic nerve hypoplasia has to do with the optic nerve not being fully developed, and there's a very particular part of the brain that's affected. So then there are other co-occurring disabilities that come with it. So it's real important for us to know all of these things so that we can support our kids. So the next piece of this, and you guys all should have a handout like this, like that handout, the framework for starting a routine. Everybody should have that handout with them. Once you've conducted that file review, what I'm going to go through now is essentially we're going to move, starting with the goals on that right-hand side of your slide. We're going to move from those goals around counterclockwise and talk through this, this framework. And it's just a tool. There's nothing magical about it. It's just a tool that we've used with teams to help them organize their thoughts when they're developing a routine. So the first thing that we want to do on that right side there is we want to look at what's the goal for this student. And we're not just pulling goals out of nowhere. Our goals have got to be based on assessment. So of course, a question that's born from that is, what assessments are we using? And these are some of my favorite assessments that I've used with this population of children. Julie developed the APT planning tool, and I think I'm sure that on your handouts, I put AAC planning tool, and that's not correct. It should be APT planning tool. Julie developed the APT planning tool in conjunction with a lot of great folks at Grantwood AEA and speech language pathologists, and I think that's a beautiful tool for us to address that area of communication that's real critical for our kids, and that routines should and could be used to support. Another tool, and I think I have a slide on this one. Yeah, I do. Subsequent to this is the communication matrix. Julie mentions that, or that in the APT planning tool. That's a free online tool. And I'm going to show you that slide as it relates to the communication matrix next, and kind of explain a little bit more about why I like it. The sensory learning kit and guidebooks, that's available through APH quota funds. You can inquire to your teacher of the visually impaired. I like that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that within this presentation as well. And the Infused Skills Assessment, it's available as part of the evaluation kit produced by TSBVI, which is Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. It's available for checkout through the Iowa Braille School Media Center. So you can contact your TVI and they can give you more information about how to check the evals kit out, and it includes the Infused Skills Assessment. And then that next tool is SAM, Symbols and Meaning. And as I look through the DLM's hierarchy, what I would say about SAM, the Symbols and Meaning tool, books, is that it's for that next level of kids that are going up to in the level of replicate, remember, and understand in that DLM's expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes. So those are some of my favorite tools. The communication matrix, what I really like about the communication matrix is that I think it's one of the only tools that goes to the earliest levels of communication and does a real nice job of moving it forward very incrementally, because some of our kids make very incremental progress. And sometimes some of the problems that or obstacles that we have with some of the assessments are that they move too quickly from step to step, and might be skipping a little bit of information or a little bit of skill in between there. And so that's kind of what I like about the communication matrix, and that it's available free online. I think I know you have to sign in and create a user, but they allow you to be anonymous. God, I couldn't remember that word. They allow you to remain anonymous. So I think the reason why they like you to sign in is because they want to gather a little research information, and they want some data about how often and how frequently the tool is being used. I've found it as a very useful tool. One thing I'm going to point out real quick is I want you to look over on this right-hand side in C14 in conventional communication. There is where it says answers yes, no. My cursor's disappearing. Where it says answers yes, no, problems or yes, no questions. Sometimes we move up that continuum quickly for our kids. And I'm not saying they can't get there. But what I am saying is that we have to be real clear about what their, I'm going to use the language, zone of proximal development is. If we move too high in that continuum, we jeopardize their ability for learning because we're challenging them too much. Hope that makes sense. That second tool that I had up there was the Sensory Learning Kit Guidebook and Assessments, and it includes assessments that move you up, and again, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, that move you more comprehensive assessments, comprehensive assessments that then include the development of goals in the areas of communication, cognition, and motor for our students. The SLK assessment, what it contains within it, the SLK guidebook, is essentially 4 sub-assessments. And they are the sensory learning summary, the arousal state profile, and, well, that third one is wrong. The third one is the sensory response record. It shouldn't be sensory learning summary. It should be sensory response record. And then the fourth one is the levels and strategies guide. So the sensory learning summary essentially is that file review that I was referring to earlier. They put a nice structure to it. I like it because it addresses all the areas for sensory input, all the medication, all the etiology issues, and helps us think through that pretty systematically. The arousal state profile, that's what I referred to a little bit earlier. Some of our kids are in extended states. Those extended states are either they're sleepy or they're agitated. And when they're in those 2 extended states, they're not available for learning. So then sometimes what our work becomes is managing those extended states so that they're either quiet alert or active alert and they're ready for instruction. That's real critical. And we have some kids, I just saw a young person not too recently that we had to get a handle on what the difference for him was between sleeping and awake, because he slept with his eyes open. So sometimes teams have to work to identify even those different states within the arousal state profile. The next assessment, it should be the sensory response record. And what the sensory response record does is determines those appetites and aversions for our students. And again, the appetites are those things that motivate attention and curiosity. That's how we're going to get our kids to engage with us. We got to know what they like. And then also it moves into their instructional level. And we are going to, let me check my PowerPoint. We're going to talk about those instructional levels next. And those instructional levels are part of the Levels and Strategies Guide, which is, there's a handout that y'all got called the SLK Intervention Levels. And at the top of that, you have those arousal states that I talked about a little bit earlier, quiet alert, active alert, and then also the partial participation routines. Those are the routines, those partial participations, that's where our learners are moving up and they're much more engaged within the activity. That SLK intervention levels, one of the reasons why I like that is because it's a little bit of a cheat sheet based on the SLK guidebook, and it will help you think about what your goals are in each of those respective areas. You got to be real clear in each of these routines what the goal is. What is this child expected to do? Because too many times our kids are being manipulated or moved through activities too quickly without a clear understanding of how exactly they're supposed to be participating and what the goal is. In terms of those intervention levels, those SLK intervention levels, and once again, you can kind of look through, refer to that SLK intervention level handout, and that'll give you much more detailed information. But those 3 levels are the quiet alert, that helps the learner establish and maintain alertness. The second one is active alert, helps the learner develop intentional behaviors as he interacts with media and partners. And the third one is partial participation, helps the learner anticipate the next step in a sequence leading to a meaningful outcome. So I'm going to refer, once again, when we look at that DLM's expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes, and we look at how pre-intentional, attend, and respond are described, you should see a pretty strong connection between those 3 levels and those 3 processes. So I I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we'll talk about it again. Appetites and aversions. We got to know what these kids' appetites and aversions are so that we can stimulate curiosity and motivate them to attend and participate in this activity with us. Otherwise, they're going back in here. We want them out with us, and we got to have fun things and things they enjoy doing in order to get them out. The tricky part becomes, what are we going to ask them to do what's the goal that we're going to ask them to do based upon their appetite? How are we going to use that appetite to meet this goal? And the aversions are real important too, and we'll talk about this. I'm going to show you some examples of these appetites and aversions lists. Aversions are really important too because we want to avoid alienating our students from instruction. Remember how we talked about in our last section on tactile strategies, that relationship piece? We don't want to do things to our kids that inadvertently drive them crazy and then alienate them from instruction, okay? And there are certain things that are going to, especially for our kids that have impaired sensory systems, there are some things that really bother them during instruction. Resources for doing this, again, is that sensory learning kit and guidebook. Also, Jane Corsten with the Every Move Counts, Clicks, and Chats. That's very similar to what to Jane's work. The thing that I would say that's different between Every Move Counts and the sensory learning kit and guidebooks is the SLK, to me, is a down and dirty version. It's much less labor intensive, and I feel like I get the same information, and frankly, I think it's a little more user friendly. You can also use more informal surveys, but what you've got to make sure that you do when you figure out what your students' appetites and aversions are is you have to assess each of those sensory systems, and don't take for granted that you know your students so well that the only thing you need to do is write a list of things he or she likes. You need to do the probes, and periodically you'll need to do the probes, review the probes periodically. And well, okay, so here's an example of a student's likes and dislikes, and this was an example that was posted in a classroom. I like it posted in a classroom for a lot of reasons, because then it's real clear to paras and any related service provider or sub working in that classroom the things that this child does not like. And specifically in Natasha's here, things that I think were real important for Natasha and that were important for adults working with Natasha to know is that she doesn't like people manipulating her hands. And we do that pretty frequently. We talked about that in the tactile strategies class. Hands off the hands. Too much hand over hand is not a good thing for our kids. She doesn't like sitting in one area for long periods of time. She doesn't like being crowded, hurried. Too much input with not enough time to process bothers her. And she doesn't like having her view blocked. She has limited visual access to information. She is visually impaired. The things that she likes: clapping, deep pressure to her palms, vibration, swimming, water play, swimming, jumping, riding on, swimming, jumping, going for a walk, wagon rides, mouthing objects. She likes to press things against her palate. And sometimes we need to let our kids have some access to mouthing items. Doesn't mean they're going to stay there forever, but sometimes we got to give them a little bit of that access and then move them out to their hands. And we'll talk more about that in our active learning session, moving them from their mouths out to their hands a little bit more. They got to find out what to do with their hands. And if they don't have a purpose for their hands, they're going to stay in here because they have immediate access and all kinds of control. And they'll probably go someplace else too. Okay. So then next thing, when we look through that brainstorming template arrows, is scheduling possibilities for the routine. What I did as a former level 3 teacher was I scripted out the students' typical daily schedule, because you know there's a lot of things we got to move around. We got G-tube feedings, we got changing, we got position changes, walking, we got all kinds of paras coming and going in the room, and related service providers. So I would script out that student's typical daily schedule, Then consider when the child is most ready to receive instruction. Some of that could depend upon medication. Remember how we talked about that a little bit earlier. If some of our kids are taking seizure medication, it flattens them. So then sometimes we might want to think, well, is this the best time to do this routine with this student? The other thing is you have to consider when staff are available. So, you know, like again, when I was teaching, lunchtime was not a good time because I had paras taking lunch breaks. And then also morning break and afternoon break times, not good times. And so within those scheduling possibilities, the final thing you do is then you got to consider where that routine will happen to. The place can be important because sometimes if we got too much noise going on, if we got too much auditory or visual stimulation going on, that can keep that child from accessing information. For instance, for our kids with cerebral palsy, and probably you guys know this, for our kids with cerebral palsy, sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, she's so nosy because whenever somebody comes in the room, she looks to see who's here. Well, sometimes what that is auditory clutter. So what that kind of can mean, I'm not saying it always means it, but what that kind of can mean is that if she's attending to this routine here, and then some novel noise comes in from the whatever side, from the right, some other adult, her brain is wired such that she's going to move her head and her attention over to where that other person is. So we got to think about noise. We got to think about visual stimulation, all of those things. And I know in these classrooms, you guys have a lot of people coming and going, but we got to think about that for our kids. Absolutely critical. Other essential information, these are some of these things that I already kind of touched about. Their ability to attend, that can be based upon location, that can also be based upon medication and etiology. Medication can be real critical because sometimes those medications prevent our kids from attending, as I sort of said earlier. Positioning, your body starts in a position that's telling you, I'm ready to do this. So if our kids are laying back, reclined in their chair, sometimes that might be communicating to them that I'm relaxing and I'm not attending right now. For some of our kids have almost got to be fully strapped in and I don't know if I want to use the word immobilized, but immobilized so that they can't attend because so much of their body is using so much energy that sometimes they need a little bit of that. And that's one of those questions where I'm talking to my PT and I'm asking them, what do you think in terms of positioning for this student? Other information includes feeding, pacing. You got to slow it way down. Watch, know your student, be an impeccable observer, watch them and know what the pacing needs to look like in order for them to stay with you. And then overstimulation. Some of our kids can get real overstimulated when we ask them to do too much. So let's see, I think I have an example. Yeah. So this next slide is an example of a completed brainstorming routines topic template. And once again, in that right-hand side, we're real clear about what her goals are going to be. Positioning for this little girl was real important because she has to be in equipment or have other support before expecting her to work. So she had a very specific position she needed to be in order to attend and then respond. Scheduling possibilities. She, in aversions, she doesn't like unfamiliar objects brought to her under her hands. She doesn't like toothbrushing, gait trainer, face and eye washing, which isn't unusual for a lot of our kids because those things come in from out of nowhere. And well, I don't think I talked about that in tactile strategies, but when you give a touch cue, well, I'll talk about that now real quick. Especially in the winter time, sometimes we're wiping our kids' noses and we don't give them any advance notice that we're about to do that. And what I would recommend is that you give them either a touch cue or an auditory cue to let them know that their nose is going to be wiped. Otherwise, we can get kids with behavior problems. I would never think about coming up behind you and wiping your nose off without giving you some kind of advance notice that that was going to happen to you. And that's what we need to give our kids too. They need some advance notice so that they know what's going to happen to them. That's part of what creates behavior problems. And then in that left-hand side, appetites, she liked Barney videos, raspberries. This was a very young little girl. Raspberries is that blowing on her hand. She really liked that with your mouth. Ready, set, go, roughness. She liked singing and a very specific person doing the singing. She likes her peers, men's voices, and the cassette player. So that's just an example of that completed brainstorming routines topic where it kind of comes together. Then the next step you're going to do is you're going to strip out that. Oh, I have a handout. I have that handout of the rough draft routine form. And if you guys want to look at that, I think it's on this next slide as well. But what you're going to do is you're going to write the potential steps of the activity out in the order they occur. The amount of detail is going to be based upon the needs of the student. So some kids, especially those kids at our very earliest stages of cognition and communication, especially those kids at that pre-intentional level, are going to need it, highly scripted out. Some of our kids, those kids at that respond, replicate, and maybe remember, you don't have to script it out quite as much. Then you have to consider modifications the child might need in order to access information. Those modifications could be things like he can't see anything below in his lower visual field, so content has to be presented up high. They need tactile access, those types of things. And that information, you're going to get through that assessment information that we talked about earlier. When you do that file review and you look through assessment information, some of those modifications are going to be contained within there. Then what I would do is do a trial run with the student. Go through that routine and reflect on potential changes that would make the routine more meaningful to the child and even to you. Because sometimes you'll write the routine and the language that you use in the routine, you'll be like, I don't feel right saying that. And then you'll re-script it. And there's nothing wrong with that. At least in that first, I would say, week. After that first week, you really want to have do those same steps and implement that routine in the same way. But you gotta do a couple of dry runs before you really get it right. So then you're going to implement the routine and periodically review based on the child's needs. What I did as a classroom teacher, full week to 2 weeks with the student, then I would have paras watch me, roll release to the paras, and then sometimes when I would have my speech language pathologist come in, my teacher of the visually impaired, PT, OT, those people, depending upon what their involvement in the goal was, I'd have them watch me do the routine and then give me some feedback. Give me some feedback about positioning, give me some feedback about language, communication, any of those things. Another way you guys could use it is just, or get that feedback is by videotaping it and sharing it with related service providers and asking them questions. And then your final step, of course, is develop more routines to support learning. And what I'm going to tell you about that first routine is it's going to be kind of tough to get out. You're going to have a little bit of a challenge. You're going to struggle a little bit. Don't overthink it. Just do it. Don't overthink it. And as you do more, it's going to get easier and easier. I know I struggled with that first one. So this is that routine template that I referred to earlier in that slide. Again, there's nothing magical about this form. You guys can create something different if you want to. What I always like to be real clear about is, what is the child expected to do? What is this? What's that targeted skill or concept within this routine? And then what exactly does the adult do? Also that modifications and supports piece. And then in that final column here, the data and comments, you can use that as comments and data. The other thing I used it for, when I first roll released to my paras, I would have them sign off on some of the steps, just so that I knew that it was being done with that same kind of consistency. I also will tell you, I posted these in my classroom when I did them, because it was good for me to review. It's good for my paras to review. It's a good static representation for us to use as we move through those steps. Anybody working with that student should know exactly what they're supposed to do and what that student is supposed to do. Consistency is real important for our kids. Here's another routines template, and I included that one with your handouts. Let me see where we're at on time. I included that one with your handouts too. And again, it's totally up to you guys. We're going to see a couple of examples, and you might even want to choose to use one of those examples or a different format. But I like knowing what the learner's supposed to do and what the learning objective is within each of those, within each of your routines. So this is a sample routine, and this is a sample routine of a little girl getting breakfast. As you can see, it's not as highly scripted as some of the ones I did. This is a little bit older too. What is it? 7 years old. So yeah, that's a little bit of an older routine, breakfast routine. She's got all the pieces to making breakfast there, and then this box in the back symbolizes that she's finished with that. So after she pours the cereal, then she puts it in that box in the back, and that means that she's finished, and she knows that objects go somewhere. Sometimes our kids will throw objects because objects appear to them out of nowhere. Objects appear to these children out of nowhere. So then when they're done, they just throw it because they think, oh, well, this is going back to that same place that it started in. So we have to teach our kids that objects belong somewhere. That's part of the reason why that basket is there. It also teaches our kids that when all these objects are in there, this activity is finished. Here's another breakfast routine, and they're using a first then calendar with it. So this isn't starting to teach concepts of time. First this, and then this, and then this is finished. This mat here in the front can serve to help this child know precisely where this activity is going to take place, especially for a child with a visual impairment. It's like a visual and or tactile marker. My bowl goes here. This is the more complicated, or I shouldn't say complicated, scripted. This is a more highly scripted routine, and that's because that's what this teacher's style was. And I think, let me check for sure, but I think this is the part where I am going to show you this routine. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now, and Julie, will you just make sure that the sound and video feed is coming through? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a sample routine. And what I want you guys to do while we're viewing this video is I want you to reflect about a few things. I want you to reflect about pacing. I want you to reflect about stress for Travis, because this was formerly a routine that gave him a lot of stress. It has to do with shaving. Shaving has to be done for Travis, for a lot of our kids, but it can be very stressful. So what the routine helped to do was lower his stress, help give him some control. That also helped to lower his stress. He knew the steps. That lowers his stress. It gives him control. That lowers his stress. He knows how he can signal to continue to bed. That lowers his stress. So all of these things within this routine, Travis is a pretty, what I would say, active participant. So I think I said pacing already. Let me move us into the video.